If you're ready to unlock more better days, to take control of your health, to push past your limits and unleash your full potential, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Bettle. For over 2 decades, I've worked with elite athletes and high performers, helping them optimize their bodies, strengthen their minds, and recover from setbacks. Now I'm bringing that expertise to you through the Vitality Collective podcast. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the science, strategies, and real-world solutions you can apply right away. Whether it's enhancing your physical performance, avoiding or recovering from injury, sharpening your mental edge, or simply feeling your best every single day. With insights from top experts and thought leaders, this podcast is designed to help you take action, feel better, and live the life that you deserve. Welcome to the Vitality Collective podcast, where every day is vital. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Brian Wolfe, a leading physical therapist and founder of Evolution Physical Therapy, who spent years bridging the worlds of pro sport and private rehab. In this episode, we take a deep dive into the missing link between being pain-free and being performance-ready. You'll learn why this rehab gap exists, how to assemble the right team around your recovery, and the mindset shift you'll need to truly heal. If you've ever felt lost or underprepared coming back from injury, this episode is for you. Let's jump in. Today, I am very excited to welcome my friend, Dr. Brian Wolfe. Brian, welcome.
Thanks, man. Can't wait. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, we're really excited to have you on. So for context, Brian and I started working together at New York City Football Club when I transitioned from the NHL to Major League Soccer. And immediately we hit it off. We're both very process-driven. We wanted structure, organization, and collaboration within the high-performance department. And we were able to create that change over time where we just had unbelievable results. One of the things that we had to put in place was injury prevention and rehabilitation programs. Now, this was something throughout my career that clubs would talk to me about as I was coming in, like we need to do a better job here. We need to not have re-injuries after rehab. We need to reduce our injury rates. And so it was so fun to work with you, Brian, on how do we create that in the soccer environment. And super excited to dig in with you specifically today because we're walking that line between pro sport and the real world. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to do, I think both of us, is bring lessons from pro sport into the real world. And you're one of the rare guys that gets to actually work in both.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and how you've developed that philosophy and how you're able to split your time.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking like for me, it's working a million hours, but I love it, right? So that's the good news, right? It's like it's working a lot of hours, but it's obviously fun. So basically, my background always was in sports. One of the reasons I got into physical therapy and rehab was because I love sports, right? I was a wrestler and a baseball player. I played soccer when I was younger, but obviously, like most American kids, started getting American football, realized I was too small, and then fell behind on soccer, right? So, always had an interest in, was always an athlete, but basically when we started was always wanted to get involved in the rehab process. Got hurt a few times, got interested in how this worked, and working at a high level in science and driving with working with athletes. And then essentially got into orthopedics and rehab that way. Wanted to continue to work with, it wasn't even my drive really to high level athletes, to be honest. Like I get just as much satisfaction. I work with one of our pro guys as I do like the weekend warrior who's in like their 50s. Like one of my first clients, I tell all the time, is a guy who played lacrosse at Cornell and now is in his 50s trying to still relive glory days, going to Lake Placid on a regular basis every summer to play in this big lacrosse tournament. So I get just a kick out of working at the weekend warriors as much as them. It's really, I find that what I like is kind of two things. From a perspective of working with people, it's obviously helping people achieve different goals and change the perception of physical therapy. And I really enjoy doing that while bridging the gap between rehab and performance, whereas I think you and I have hit that off and really try to do that a lot. And then ultimately what really drove me into pro sports and what I particularly love about New York City Football Club and why we hit it off was my favorite part of being in those rooms is, yes, it's great to work with pro athletes. I love working with the front office staff. Don't get me wrong, all that stuff. But it's being around other really like high performance driven individuals, particularly the athletic trainers, the, performance guys and the sports science guys, the guys who are physical therapists and they're with me. That to me is what's actually the most fun. Is it pushes me in a whole nother realm. And you nailed it. Is then the goal now is to try and take what we've learned in pro sports and bring it into what we do. We started a practice called Evolution Physical Therapy, as you know. We've got 21 locations across the country, and we're not only involved in New York City Football Club from what I do with the consulting side of it, but also we do stuff with, LAFC. We've done stuff with Burton Snowboards. We've done stuff with the LA Marathon. We've done things with, several different pro organizations all across the country. And we used to do the Premier Lacrosse League is where I originally started, and got my feet wet in pro sports, and then eventually moved over into the MLS. And so I find that, that whole travel of what I've recognized is what's happening at a higher level there could certainly be applied into private practice, into physical therapy, and brought to the public. And so that's really what is I don't want to call it my main job, but obviously my company's mission, from what I do. So that's definitely the aspect of my kind of journey through this.
Yeah, beautiful. So Brian, I think as I saw rehabilitation evolve, coming out into pro sport, there was a huge gap and often silos. You said it: medical, rehab, performance. These are not different groups for me. These are all one department operating on a spectrum. Can you describe a little bit of what it's like? Like, let's talk about my journey. If I get injured, I tear my ACL. I'm playing sport on the weekend. I'm an ex-rugby player who just wants to stay active, like your guy with lacrosse.
Yeah.
What's my journey through this current insurance model?
That's a great question, right? And it's incredibly nuanced, right? And I'll start it off with, it was funny. I was at a school function for one of my kids, and it was great. You just start chatting up parents and conversations. So one of the guys goes, "Is insurance a pain in the ass?" Right, to say it bluntly. And I was just like, "Yeah, it totally is." Right, like there's no other way to put it, right? And the reality of the insurance aspect of what we factored in, and why we also have factored the way that we've created it. Every insurance is different, right? And we're in network with all the major insurance companies like United Healthcare and Cigna and Blue Cross Blue Shield, and each one of them have their quirks. Each policy is individual to each person as well. I go, that's what's tough. I said, when we look at a room of 200 people, there could be legitimately 200 different policies in here. And I go, that's the issue. And so I think when it comes to something like an ACL surgery, that's actually in my mind one of the better ones, mainly because with a surgery, it's justified to a certain degree, right? The issue is, and again, I think, look, insurance and insurance companies are beholden to investors, right? They're publicly traded companies. And, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, and I don't want to soapbox too much on what I think about that, but nevertheless I think that when it comes to like an ACL, the reality of when I look at pro sports, I mean, we've had players that we've worked with who had an ACL tear that we would say, hey, this is a 9-month rehab, right? You're thinking about the acute phase and that first, couple of months where we're trying to get them back and moving. Then the middle 3 months or so, right, we're really trying to transition from starting range of motion to getting back into, hey, we're going to get back into running, straight line running, maybe a little bit of cutting. We're going to really work on ultimately trying, not even the return to sport phase just yet, but we're going to begin on the back end of that. But what we're going to start doing is really starting to do more dynamic movements, compound movements in the gym and so forth. Then that last part, we're really going to start the return to sport phase, the fitness phase, and the injury prevention phase, right? And so to me, in that process, that last piece generally gets skipped in the clinic because of insurance. And what I have found is a big gap, in my opinion. And I don't want to I also don't want to bash medical professionals here, because I understand why it happens. But what naturally happens is if you talk with certain orthopedic surgeons who maybe aren't associated with a team on a regular basis and involved in that conversation, ultimately what happens is they'll say, well, they're ready to go at 6 months. Whereas, there's certain people like, hey, what if we do, biodex testing, force plate testing? Let's look at all the different metrics and do these things and ultimately come up with a, hey, there's an asymmetry here or there isn't, and he's ready to go back. And some people might be ready, right?
Yeah, that Brian is the exact gap I have been seeing. And the one that we tried to eliminate, when I first got into pro sport, it was 15, 16, 17 years ago. And that was a problem, right? And that comes from this siloed model. And surgeons have been trained in what they've been trained in, right? They're going to surgically repair that. Once that graft reaches maturation, their role in it is done.
Yeah.
And so I think there are just different clearances. So if we go back to my process, I tear my ACL, I go see my surgeon, I get the surgery done. He gives me a script for physical therapy, and I come see you, and I go through my physical therapy. That 6-month period, doc comes, does a quick test. Yep, graft's healed. What happens then? Does insurance just cut it off? Or like how does that work?
It depends. The good news for most insurances is they're not going to go just based off of the doc, right? And most docs also understand this game, right? So to a certain point, right, insurance may have authorization periods. Those are the worst. Like if that's probably the worst thing in my opinion that's happening to insurance companies is insurance companies have essentially hired third parties that say no.
Right.
So essentially what we have to do is we have to apply for visits, right? 12 visits, 6 visits, 10 visits. And in the case of an ACL, they will cut you off at a certain level of function. And they'll say, hey, they're 80%, right? Like we don't pay for that last 20%, right?
Right.
And so that will happen. Now, I think ultimately when you look at, different processes for people, that's where cash-based services come in. And by the way, that could occur well before 6 months for certain insurance policies. It may not kick in depending on other policies, right? So that's essentially what happens is if somebody's got, if they say, oh, the graft's healed, the majority, I would say, of people, their insurance is going to run out at some point, right?
Yeah.
That's what I noticed. Now, that being said, not everybody's. There are some, right, that it actually continues, but it also, like I have seen pretty regularly, and I think that's why there were certain papers and research that came out that said, hey, 80% symmetrical for certain athletes, and they're good to go. But you and I both know that when it came to pro sports, that was never like enough, right? For us, we were like, oh, it has to be 95% of this, what we're looking at for our performance perspective and injury prevention, right? So that's the problem.
Yeah, that's really where I saw that gap. And when I first came in, that gap from grafts matured, insurance has cut you off, that was coming into pro sport. And what I found was that at that 6-month period, or name the injury, when the doc's intervention had physiologically healed, the doc was walking into the GM's office and telling them that he was cleared. Now, for years, we've heard that the biggest predictor of injury is previous injury. And I've always believed that was down to essentially not completing the rehab. You talked about the injury prevention phase. When you cut off at it stopped hurting, the graft healed, okay, you can go back to sport. We found that it was just woefully unprepared. The athlete was just not even close to function. Even if they didn't get re-hurt, that was where you'd hear they were never the same again.
Yep, for sure.
Right? Because the athlete just didn't return to previous performance levels.
And let's take that ACL case, right? I remember sitting with a doc from HSS, and he literally showed us the statistics on ACL and that process. And you had talked about why when physical therapists first started entering in pro sports, because, if you remember, we hired the 8th. I remember this being staggering to me, was the 8th physical therapist in the MLS back when I started 5 years ago. Now there's 2 physical therapists just on New York City's football club staff now, right?
Right.
So when you think about 30 plus teams, like it's obviously exploded with how many more physical therapists are entering into those places. And I think what you're talking about is the main gap. They would talk about all the time how 66% of these ACL surgeries for athletes would get back to prior level of function. 66%. That's 2 out of 3. So that
Crazy.
means that if we tore 3 ACLs in 3 years, one of those players' careers is totally fucked, right? Like if you really think about that,
Right.
or there's going to be a sudden decline. And so, and that's just from that level. And again, like I would almost argue that I bet that at the pro level, it might even be lower, like 50%, because if you think about now, if we don't complete those rehabs and they're going to go at that same speed, it's never the same, right?
Exactly.
So I think when you think about, and then we haven't even talked about, re-tear rates of ACL. So I can't help but think that a lot of those would be better, right? Along with the fact that if we think about all the other processes for hamstring strains or calves or quads or other compensatory stuff, the ACL tear on the other side, like not taking the time to complete the full rehab is in my opinion, one of the travesties that occurs. And again, I think that one of the things that you see, particularly with that last 6 months, like after 6 months, part of that rehab, if you ever look at rehab protocols that are issued by orthopedic surgeons, which again, there's another soapbox you don't even get me on, but in terms of like that process, that's why I think they're very vague, because ultimately, like they're not completed normally. So it just is part of the problem.
Yeah, and so that really nicely defines the gap, right? So I see over and over again, and it's, again, now we've started to correct some of that in sport, but now I'm out of sport. I just sat with a 16-year-old ballerina, right? She dislocated her patella and had a surgery, and basically sat on a table and got laser for 3 months, and then the doc essentially said, okay, you're good to go. And she's down in the dumps because she's not feeling right or anywhere close to where she was. And now she's going back and she's not dancing well. She's in pain. She goes back to see the doc. He says, well, come back and see me again in 3 months. And if it still doesn't feel better, we've got to do another surgery. And that could potentially end your career. So pain-free in the rehab process isn't prepared for sport. We go back to the ACL. The stats every day after 9 months is an exponential increase in your return to performance and your risk of re-injury. So you can dramatically reduce. Really, it's 9 to 12 months as an appropriate timeline to come back to sport and really perform. So the gap being, you're physiologically, medically healed. Insurance has stopped paying. Now what? And I think what we lost sight of is, what are we preparing them for? Right? These are the demands. This is the sport. It's not good enough to just say, if you're a general population, just stop doing that. Just don't play basketball anymore. Just stop ballet. Well, no, that's the thing that you like doing. How do we bridge that gap from insurance stopped paying or your doc cleared you back to performance? What's your view on that?
I think ultimately, and this is going to sound, maybe this isn't the answer. Like I personally think it's going to take physical therapists, because they're probably the person in there that's going to be that conversation, or someone like yourself, right? So someone who's doing that rehab process are going to have to realize that they have to be really good salesmen. Not crazy, they'll say. So here's why, and hear me out when we do this.
Right.
When I first started our business, we didn't take insurance. We were all cash based, right? And then we transitioned into insurance as we grow and help more people. And we do continue to offer cash based services to a client like you're just kind of talking about. And I remember at one point doing a rehab for somebody who was coming off a shoulder surgery. And what happens is, I think the doctor, like you're talking about, and the aspect of when that happens is we don't even realize we're being pre-programmed to operate. I've heard this is a line that you've probably even heard people say in the private sector that would never happen in pro sports, right? And this is why I think it's important. Well, let's go twice a week or even once a week so we can save visits for later from the insurance company. And to me, that's the problem right there. That mindset. It's not even the comment, it's the mindset. The mindset really should be, No, you're hiring me. And I use this line for clients all the time. I go, what's your primary goal? Is your primary
Right.
goal going back to be a ballerina at full and go back to your career? Or is it to utilize your insurance benefits to the best of its possibility?
Right.
Right? There's that sales line. And the reality is most people are uncomfortable to do that and have that conversation with people. And instead will avoid it and say, well, we're going to really use your insurance. And then when the person doesn't get better, they'll blame it on their insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, if the insurance was better and we could do more, blah, blah. Bullshit. Like what should happen is we should have a conversation. Listen, here's the deal. I'm going to maximize the insurance benefits as much as possible. But there are other mechanisms. If you want to get to this goal, we may need to do X, Y, and Z thing. And in our company, we've built all these different things, like from PT classes to fitness things, because we see this gap to what you're talking about. We knew we needed to bridge it. And so to me, that's an essential piece of it. I think, healthcare providers need to start treating the human being as though here's what we have to do, and you'll just have to figure out the insurance side versus, and again, and the company like ours will help with as much as possible with that. However, at the same time, the mindset of the therapist has to be, well, how am I going to get this person back to sport? And we need to restore
Yeah.
that for most people. Like that to
Yeah.
me is the key with that. So it's actually, I think that's what happens, because I'll never forget that. The first client, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I don't have like a parameter I have to worry about. So like, how would I do the rehab as properly as
Yeah.
possible? Oh, I would do it this way. Right. And then all of a sudden I started
Right.
thinking, oh my God, I've been like in this totally different mindset for it. And like,
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to when it
Yeah.
comes down to that process, just removing that thought process in your head.
I love that around the mindset. We see it over and over again, like even down to blood work, right? Oh,
For sure.
we test this ApoB. Well, our insurance doesn't cover that. Oh, okay. And so people just wouldn't do it. Well, how much is it? It's $3, right? Like, but no one ever asks that, or it's never offered, right? And
Yeah.
I think the mindset overall, and this was the biggest thing when I came into Toronto. This was the biggest thing we had to change, and it was similar with New York. We had to change from medically cleared rehab. Okay, now they're performance, right? We're done with them. And even as we started introducing these systems into NYCFC, we had a fantastic PT on staff there in Nick. But it was a foreign concept to him that he was still going to be overseeing rehab all the way up to the day the guy was actually playing in full games.
Yep.
He had been like, okay, well, rehab, we're done with him. And so we talked about it the other day, but we introduced a spectrum rather than your job description. It was actually what your skill set.
For sure.
And what we needed to understand at every single level of the whole human, as you said, we had to understand what were the criteria to be able to move through that rehab process. And it was just a spectrum of intensity. You had to go from down here, you had the surgery and you're doing some very low level acute rehab. And you had to progress all the way back up here to MLS Cup final.
Yep.
So what were the demands of each step that you had to go through? And was your body prepared for them? And we could measure each one of those specifically and objectively. But we had to understand that everyone was involved every single day through every phase of the rehab. Your strength coach was involved down here. Your doc and your PT were involved up here. And that 6-month medical clearance was just one of the milestones. It was one of the criteria that we had to pass. Every step you missed, you increased the susceptibility to injury and you reduced the athlete's performance. And so for me, it's mindset, not only around insurance aren't going to pay for this, but also I'm one cog in the engine. And there are specialists who are great at every bit, and it's not all on me. And I think that's the thing for physios, athletic trainers, surgeons, and strength coaches to understand that we are one team working on one human system, and we're just preparing it at different levels of intensity.
I totally agree, and I think one of the lines that you had used the other day that I think was really, really wise is when you think about a laundry list, when we're trying to think about, all right, here's where we are and here's where we want to be and here's the path to how we're going to get there. It doesn't necessarily need to be, well, so, and this is where I think training rooms can go wrong, and this can lead to those silos and disconnects and not a team approach is, well, I want to be right about this, or I want to be right about that, right? And so I'm going to help with this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to do what this guy did, and I'm not going to do it. And like what it does, it leads to like, if I'm wrong in a situation and someone else is right, we can be doing both as long as we're not contraindicating each other or hurting one another's, right? The answer is we can always work on things together as a team, because ultimately when it gets better, we just had this happen where I'm still not 100% sure I'm wrong, but now I'm less sure that I'm right? In a treatment of an athlete. And the surgeon was doing one thing, another PT was doing another thing, I was thinking about this, and we basically said, these are the things we're all going to do. We're going to work on this, and the best case scenario is that the guy's going to get better. The worst case scenario is the guy's going to get better, right? Like if you set it up for success, and something we haven't even talked about yet is, I think then even the process, whether again it's my guy who I was talking about is playing lacrosse in Lake Placid who's here, or a professional athlete, explaining the why, right? Explaining why we're doing this, what we're thinking about, how we're going to do it. This is the thought process of the path of what we want to do. That to me, I think is also so essential, because it builds trust in the athletes and the rehab team. And that is important because, I've seen it I've seen it happen now a bunch of times where, I think that's another part that happens with insurance is the thought process of, well, like this person's not, a great example is this, like I've worked with pro athletes through their insurance, right? And so the insurance, if they kick back and they say, well, like for his sport, blah, blah, we don't pay for that. I'm like, well, do you pay for return to work stuff? They go, oh yeah, of course. I go, well, this is an athlete, right? Like he needs to be able to do this stuff. It's his job. This is how he earns money, right? And so all of a sudden it's, oh, well, that's different. Exactly. Like it's not, we have to evaluate people at different levels for their goals and where they're at, right? And so I think when you think about that process of where I think we've done a really good job at NYCFC, and I've really watched it work well, is everybody's opinion is accounted for. Everybody talks together. Everybody gets on the same page. And what that allows is for everybody's skill sets to shine. And even if one person has an idea that works, or somebody has an idea that doesn't work, or something builds, there's always built-in fail-safe systems. So essentially everybody can operate properly. And in essence, if it's communicated properly to the players should have complete trust in how that process all works. Right. And so that I think sometimes can be a challenge for sure. Especially in a sport like soccer where you've got multiple languages going on and different things like that along in that capacity. But yeah, I think that's a huge part of all these systems and building them.
Yeah. I love what you're saying there. And I want to break that down for people who aren't familiar with this high performance concept of every different role that's involved sits down and talks together. So this ultimately comes down to communication, creating high trust. Outside of sport, it would be a high trust referral network. In sport, it's a high trust interdisciplinary team. But the trust and the respect between practitioners, and let's be explicit about that. When you get a big injury, you're going to need a surgeon. You're going to need a physical therapist, an athletic trainer. You're going to need a great strength coach, and you're going to need your sport coach, all to be involved in the conversation around your return to play. And that's the complete spectrum we were talking about. The communication piece, I think, is really essential.
For sure.
Respecting, me and you can't possibly have the same view of an ACL injury. You have completely different training than I do. And so if I say, here's how I want to approach the ACL, and you say, here's how I want to approach the ACL, we can both be right.
Exactly.
It's different perspectives. So long as nothing's happening that's contraindicated for that phase of rehab, and if we both do that, now we're force multipliers for one another.
Exactly.
Right. So this is additive and exponential. This isn't 1 + 1 = 2. This is 1 + 1 = 3.
Yes.
And everyone that we add in, and every different perspective we get, and everybody working together in a coordinated fashion to solve the problem, we get a complete solution for the person who's important, and that's the patient or the athlete.
100%. So I love that analogy, that word of a force multiplier. That's 100% how it works, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and whoever's coordinating that approach, it's what do you need and when, and how much of what, at what stage, right? No one's ever at zero. And I think letting go of that ego and that territory of I'm the PT, I'm the athletic trainer, I'm rehab, you can have him when I'm done.
Yep.
I think those are the most dangerous mindsets from a practitioner. And I think, for everybody listening who is going through this process and is seeking out practitioners, you should interview them.
For sure.
Talk to them about your mindset. Talk to them about their mindset around you. How are they going to refer you through a network of providers? What's their structured plan to bring you back to return to performance, not just, okay, it stopped hurting, see ya.
Yep. Yep, for sure. And then what's the goal and the outcome? So what are we trying to get from this perspective? Are we trying to, continue with physical therapy and then eventually go to, fitness programs? Are we trying to
Mm-hmm.
go back to a sport? What are we going back to work? Like that's the difference when it comes to like pro athletics and like the private practice side is like when it comes to private practice, it's easy. It's like, all right, what are the different goals the person has? When you do it from that approach, what it really does is it makes you patient centric and go back to what are the goals with this? And I love asking that line. And if people ever, a tactical way that I do this, it's outside of sport, because the reality is that's pretty easy. If you're in a team, you're like, oh, to go back to playing high level, professional sport, like that's easy, right? When it comes, right, like that's an easy one. And then easy-ish, I guess.
Because, again, this is the problem I had to solve when I
Yes.
started getting the performance director jobs. You would think that was the case. But again, that GM's walking in at 6 months. Okay, he's cleared.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Not even close. Like he wasn't even allowed in the weight room before that point.
Yes, that's the problem.
And so it's a mindset that's pervasive. Now it feels intuitive to us because we've made that change and we've put the communication and the structures and we've put everybody in their right place. One of the things I loved about the docs that we brought in, David Gonzalez and those guys to be our medical team, was that they knew what their part was and they knew what everyone else's part was. And they knew where they fell in the system. But a lot of times that wasn't the case. And so it wasn't as intuitive. And I think certainly outside of sport, it's completely non-intuitive because we're so reliant on this medical system versus respecting everybody along that spectrum, each having an equally important role in their full return to rehab. So we tend to lean on that medical opinion. I got to talk to my doc.
Yep.
And your doc just cleared you after sitting on your ass for 3 months to go and play your sport again, right?
Well, and I think what you just mentioned, and I was with David yesterday, so it's funny to, when you think about that process in general, right? What can happen on the other side, like in private practice, for a lot of PT, strength coaches, ATs, etc., chiros, whoever's doing these rehabs. What ultimately can happen is, well, let me talk to my doctor. Well, my doctor said this, and then what happens is, to your point, it's very easy to get pitted against one another. And it's something that you have to fight constantly because it's even internally, right? Like it's this jockeying of like, well, who's right, who's wrong, all those types of things, right? And checking those egos and making sure that we're all, trying to have that emotional intelligence that we're able to be like, all right, this is not an attack on me, not an attack on them. We just need to communicate better and go forward. And I think that works a little bit easy. Well, I shouldn't say, because I've also been in bad training rooms too. It works. It can be done easier in a professional sport arena because ultimately we're all on the same team legitimately, right? Like we're all
in
trying.
the same room.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's where I feel like what naturally happens to a lot of places like us is we try and put more services under one roof because we know that communication can be optimized, just from a standpoint of proximity, right? And so, yeah, I mean, to your point about that, I think being collaborative is so important. And then making sure, like, it's not about my ego. It's not about this one. It's not about that. Like, here's what we need to think about of how we put this together and how we can connect the dots so this athlete can be back to, the high performer we need him to be, right, to win a championship. Like, that's the whole goal for all this stuff.
Yeah. So I think what we can do for people who don't have guys like us to guide them through the process is, you talked about some phases earlier.
Mhm.
There's sort of acute, there's rehab, and then there's sort of a return to play and return to performance phase loosely, right?
Yep.
There's a lot of granularity within that. Where do you see people being involved in that process, and who owns the phase and the handoff throughout that piece?
That's a great question. I think it's I would almost split them into I to like my brain went to here first. I would also split them up into non-operative rehabs and then operative rehabs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, quite frankly, I was thinking about this actually the other day. I think with some of the operative rehabs, right, this is actually easier
Yeah,
because there's less variables on the what ifs and the speed is just slower, right? It allows,
right.
like, if somebody's out from a non-operative injury, like a
Yeah,
hamstring or a quad or a calf, and we see this process go together, ultimately it's well, how fast can he be back, right? Is it
yeah,
1 week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 3 weeks? Like, what is that? What's the speed, right? And so there's the pressure of that under that gun.
yeah,
Under an ACL, we know it's 9 months. It's a long-term rehab.
yeah.
As we go through that, I mean, really, right now at NYCFC, knock on wood, right? Generally speaking, we seem to have only about one or two of those going at once, right? Those long-term rehabs. Most of them are on the other side, the non-op stuff, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
they're the lingering, the back thing, the calf here, the hamstring. So I think when it comes to long-term rehab, there is like, say we use that ACL example. There's a surgeon, I do the surgery, right? And then I hand off to the physical therapist. Those two are talking big time, right? And obviously you can obviously have the athletic trainer with the initial diagnoses as well with that surgeon on how we're diagnosing this ACL. Is there additional ligaments? Are we talking about a meniscus involvement? Are we talking about other ligaments that are involved as well? Um, then we have the rehab process. That could also be done by an AT and PT.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it leans more into the PT realm and training, but that can be done together. And then ultimately, I think that the baton starts to be handed off at around 2 to 3 months, right? Where all of a sudden we're really starting to get the idea behind the strength coaches of where we can go and
Mm-hmm.
what different things we can talk about, because the fitness side of this is also going to be important. Obviously, and just because it's that process kind of handing off the baton, we can both be holding the baton at the same time, right?
Yes, I love that. Thank you.
Right. And the aspect of that is, I'm not saying the physical therapy, I think that's another big one. The physical therapist is discharging you to so and so, right? I think what happens is that handoff becomes more and more and more as we go through the process. I think
Mm-hmm.
once you get, optimally around 4 months, the physical therapist is doing a lot of gym work, and hopefully we can start doing some movement, running, cutting. We're doing stuff on the
Mm-hmm.
water treadmills earlier than that, right at 3 months. When we get somebody on a field, now all of a sudden we're really doing more S&C stuff. And obviously PTs can be involved in that process. ATs can be involved in that process.
Right.
Who's ever good at on-ball work, right, whatever. And then once you get into the 6-month process, I mean, the physical therapist is more looking at the other things that we need to implement.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's much more S&C work. It's more gym, on field, and so forth. And I
Yeah.
remember having a conversation, where there was a player who was going through an unhappy triad, and I remember the S&C coach, the process the physical therapist is involved there towards that phase is not just helping with the programming to implement return to sport, but also the reassurance for the S&C
Yeah.
coaches, right? Because I
Yeah.
remember having a conversation, we were talking about it, he goes, I'm throwing everything I have at this player. Like, I've got everything involved. We're doing this. And I said, sometimes it just takes time, man. Right? Like,
Yeah.
it just creates a reassurance. Like, you're doing the right stuff. I'm watching. I see everything that's going on. Sometimes it just takes some more time.
Mm-hmm.
And that process works. And then we go off of objective testing, and that is all collaborative. I
Right.
think that was one of the things that I noticed off the bat when I first got to NYCFC was how much data we were collecting, but how little we were utilizing it. And I
Exactly.
think
Yeah.
that's the key with the physical therapist and strength coach in that capacity, or the AT, is how are we looking at data? How are we utilizing it on a regular basis? And how can we utilize it in the rehab process?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that was a big part. I think when you go to the non-op side, it's just trickier because that baton is a shorter race. So what happens
Mm-hmm.
is, ultimately, there's a lot more of the athlete that's held onto, because ultimately, if we can try and shrink the rehab process to only 14 days,
Mm-hmm.
obviously the luxury you have in pro sports is, I might see an athlete for an ankle sprain, lateral ankle sprain to get them back on the field in 2 to 3 weeks.
Right.
I might see him in the private practice sector for 3 visits in that time, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe 4, right? 5,
Right.
6, whatever. The reality is in pro sports, I'm seeing them every day. So I see them all the time. But I also know the micro pieces of what I want to
Yeah.
implement. And I think that handoff on the S&C side, my goal is to try and make that a faster handoff, mainly because if I can keep their fitness level up, I
Yeah.
know there's less work for that S&C coach to have to do on the back end to
Yeah.
get them physically fit and back in matches, right? I know neurologically where we've built.
Something I'd love to dig into a little bit, because that was where, when we started putting this system in at NYCFC, Nick was used to literally being a handoff. What I always envisage for the relationship between the physio and the S&C, and that's a strength and conditioning coach for people who don't know that terminology, was it's almost like putting the bumpers on the bowling lane. Your
Yep.
physical therapist oversees the rehab, not in that they have to do all of the roles, but they provide the framework to say, okay, in this phase, this is what they're cleared to do at this intensity. And if we can perform at our highest level within those barriers, within those bumpers, and I can go to my PT every day and say, hey, are they cleared to do this? And they say, yep, yep, yep. Maybe modify this one a little bit. That's how we keep going. That's how everyone's involved at every level. It's not that I need the PT to do the strength and conditioning work. It's that I need them to be involved enough to say they're cleared for straight ahead work right now. Okay, we're moving towards the next phase. Let's start introducing some lateral work. Let's
Yep.
start introducing some plyos ahead of running. Right? That's the involvement and the communication, where it is a gradual handoff. I love that concept of we can both hold on to the baton.
For
And
sure.
I think that's so important at every stage, all the way through. With your doc being those buffers for the PT early, your PT being the buffer for the strength coach late, and then saying to the strength coach, okay, no limits. They're a perfectly healthy athlete that need reconditioning. Go.
Exactly. I think too, what's interesting in that process, right, is pro sports was the first time that I was really exposed to a lot of like GPS data, force plate testing, all of those different processes and machines on how we can, even handheld dynamometry. Like we were doing that kind of work, we were doing that stuff. We were doing jump testing and Y balance, but it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't being implemented as well as it was in pro sports. And
Yeah.
I got to a point where I was like, I see what we're doing here. We're measuring this all the time.
Yeah.
So we're just being very, very, very objective, right? And what that does, it creates, to your point, it allows me to create bumpers. And it's like, well, it's pretty simple. If we have this data that we've collected for sprinting, we know what his, max sprinting capacity is. And we know what his tolerance is to meters and what it needs to be. And we know ultimately that if his force plate testing is this and we see these asymmetries here, we understand that there's an impact if there's something new and the data just suddenly changed. Right. I love this idea that, and Dave has taught me some of this as well, is there's 2 different types of the fatigue on the central nervous system as well, right, that we can play with, right? It's that acute phase. So that
Mm-hmm.
day, post, +1 match day, +2, right, in that capacity. But then there's also the chronic load,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we're looking at that, we measure both these things. Well, for me, that makes a lot of sense on the performance side. But what I don't think happens on a regular basis is that communication for performance to physical therapists. And this happens in the NYCFC now, so that's the good news that we can talk about.
Right.
But the reality of what I think gets lost in a lot of places is here's this data that we have on these players. And if I'm rehabbing somebody back from not even an ACL, let's make it even easier to use that ankle sprain analogy, or like a hamstring strain, right? So a grade 2, right, hamstring. So we got a partial tear with fiber disruption, and we're trying to figure out when the person's ready to sprint at a max speed. Well, if I have somebody running and I say, hey, run about 70%, and the person based off of data is saying, he's like, that's 70%, but he's really only running 64%. When I go to 80%, I say, hey, run 80%, and maybe he's only getting at 72%. I am certain that he's not running enough, or where is that? And if I say, hey, now I want you to run 100%, no problem, he's going to run 100%. But say on that sprint, he's only hitting, 83% or 87%. It's like, all right, now we still see that we're maybe this match we're holding him, and we're going to rehab a little process and give it another day, right? And so it just allows you to be super clear, and I could just say, here's what it looks like, right? Like I don't have to be subjective anymore. And so, and this, like, athletes, they're all over the place, right? Some guys are like, I want to be out there and I'm going to play, and some guys are like, I'm nervous, I'm not sure. It's like they're just like they're normal people, just like us, right? So like it's one of those things where I think it objectifies and creates the performance data along with that process and allows it to utilize it from the rehab side. That was the first thing that I noticed. I was like, can I look? And I remember some of the first times that I said, hey, can I look at the data with you guys just as we're doing the rehab process? And I had been with the club for maybe 2 weeks. And I remember the first reaction was, hey, Brian wants to look at some of the data.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah. Right. And so that's what happens. Right. The aspect is that uncomfortable conversation. Honestly, I was so obtuse to it, I didn't even realize it. So it's one of those things where it does take that collaboration, and it does take that communication constantly.
And it's the understanding, like you said, like, why would anyone be like, ooh, why do you want to look at this data? Like it's your data. It's the athlete's data.
Yes.
And the first thing I did with every program I went into was everybody is meeting every morning to talk about every athlete on the roster. And nothing is secret from anyone in the room, because you democratize that information and you take away the power of information being currency.
Yes.
Right. I've got the information. People need to talk to me. So we get that all out in the open. In the real world, you're probably not going to have that data.
Yeah.
And I think each individual, as we start to wrap here and really land this for everyone, the important thing is that you are going to become your own performance director. You have to oversee that process. And this has to make intuitive sense to you. The question I'd like you to ask as you're going through that process, as somebody who's in the rehab process, when people are clearing you for activity, understand what you're going to go back and play. And have you done anything since your injury that looks like that? Your job and your rehab team's job is to close the gap. You talked about acute and chronic, Brian. We would use those metrics every single day.
Yep.
Have you trained up to the level and closed the gap between where you are and where you get to? Because what you've got to remember, what can happen in a 3-month rehab, in the 3-month acute phase, is that you don't just stay where you were, you actually get worse. Yes. You lose conditioning, you lose strength, you lose capacity. So that gap gets even bigger. It's imperative that you safely take steps and make progress, and it's incremental. And you've got to ask at every stage, if you haven't done any strength training and your doc says, okay, you're cleared for running, does that feel right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's a big part of being out in the public, out in the real world, not having access to this data.
For sure. And I think that's why that testing, that's why we started basically implementing our sports med testing.
Yeah.
We also have somebody out in Los Angeles who's in the WNBA. And so she then brought into our clinic, same thing, like the vault plate testing and different aspects of what we're bringing in all the time, and creating basically like the harmonization of range of motion testing, manual muscle testing with dynamometry, doing force plate testing, doing jump testing, right? All that stuff. And I think it allows you to really break down the data and fix that asymmetry. And so to your point, we're doing that on a regular basis. And I think one of the things that I find that's frustrating, I think, to a degree, and I think that pro sports is really, like kind of we just talked about how the objectification is so important. A lot of my PTs will be like, well, I can already tell like he's moving pretty well. I pretty much know what the data is going to say. And I was like, I get what you're saying, and I get that you're that confident in it.
Yeah.
But then at the end of the day, why are we not running this one test for one appointment to one thing? Well, what about the time? All right, no, and then you talk about the insurance side, right? That's the insurance mindset. Let's just circle back. That is, well, then I'm going to waste a visit on their insurance. Well, have
Mm-hmm.
you been the salesman to talk about, listen, I really want you to go get this specific test done, right? And maybe we're doing it outside of insurance. Maybe they're going to pay, $100, 100 whatever dollars to do this session. But it's all about testing to just guarantee and make sure we know where we're at so we can ultimately look where we're going, right? And I think that's super, super important. And I mean, to your point, I can think of a rehab that we were together with was an Achilles tendon rupture. And I remember we were about 7.5 months in, and he was back to pretty high performance. He was on field, he was doing stuff. And I just remember him walking in, he just goes, listen, can you work on my neck today? My neck is just super sore. And so the other caveat to all this, to throw in a monkey wrench, is it's not just the testing that you're looking at from the actual injury. Then you got to look at the whole person and athlete as a whole. And I remember thinking, I was like, of course, like he's just not neurologically ready and adapted. He was doing a lot of stuff with like headers that day when it came and ultimately what was his neck was just really, really fatigued to the point where it was painful. And so ultimately, if we kind of like bulldozed through that and didn't even accommodate any of that or didn't look at that process, again, that to me is another quote unquote objective finding where I'm like, oh, look, like this, he's still not ready, because ultimately, like, we could put him in a match, he goes head to head with somebody, or he goes against the ball, and all of a sudden now we've got a cervical strain that's got him out for 3 weeks.
Well, in hockey, that was always my concern when we were returning people from, say, a broken foot from blocking a shot. Wasn't that the foot or the ankle was going to break. It was that they were going to get a groin strain when they came back.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
In soccer, it wasn't that they were going to re-tear their ACL. It was they were going to tear their hamstring.
Yes.
Now we're looking at, as I said before, you are a healthy athlete who is out of shape and needs to be reconditioned. And that is everything.
Exactly.
Right. That's every tissue has deconditioned. And so now we're looking at, okay, what's your susceptibility to all injuries now? Because we're happy with the one injury. So now we globally zoom out and we're preparing the athlete. And, I think that there's just such importance to people monitoring that themselves, knowing how they feel, knowing that they need to take those steps to prepare. Implementing this in a business model is challenging, really challenging. But I do think that this really redefines health and performance. And I think the biggest takeaway I want anyone listening who's going through injury or who's not ever recovered from an injury, still having pain, insurance isn't going to take you through this whole spectrum. You are going to have to invest in some cash pay services to close the gap. Right? Insurance isn't built to take you back to full function. So it's going to be cash pay PT. It's going to be cash pay trainers and strength coaches. I think that's a really important area. But this siloed model of medical, PT, fitness, that's what we blew up in sport. It's an outdated model. And that's what's redefining health and performance as we move forward.
I agree. I'm going to even be grimmer on the insurance side. They are actually not incentivized and they do not have anything to gain from taking you through that full amount, right? To take you through the full, like circling back to that ACL is, if the insurance paid for the entire rehab for 9 months, they in theory are losing money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, they want to cut you off at some point. They want that to happen so that you eventually go through and use and pay, right? Because ultimately they save dollars that way. And so when you think about it that way, it's important to understand, okay, this process, where's the goal that I want to get to? What do I need to do? How do I need to do that? And how do I need to start that process? And thinking about that mindset now on day one. And I think that to me is a very good message to a lot of people if they're going through injury, is to think about that process on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think going into it right away with the injury, just knowing what that's going to take. What do you want to get back to? Where are you now? And who's going to be involved? Who's on your team throughout that process?
Yep.
Insurance is going to be there for some of it. Your physician's going to be there for some of it. But no one of us can do all of that function.
Yeah. And how are they communicating amongst one another? right? Like that's huge too. Hey, can you go? I remember one, I had a patient, this is back when I was younger in my career. This is 10 plus years ago, but I remember it was a patient with total hip replacement. Right. And this is stuff that, again, I've changed now mindset. He goes, I was like, I really haven't talked to your doctor, but I'm pretty sure we can do this now. Right. I said that. Again, this is younger version of me, right? I wouldn't do that now. But
I've been
exactly. And I remember when he said, he goes, listen, here's my doctor's number. They said they'll talk to you. Just give him a call. Literally right now during the session. He wanted to meet. That's what he valued the most in that session.
right.
I picked up the phone, called, and I was validated. Yes, he was ready to go in that scenario. I was right. However, that patient, and exactly, you laughed because you thought of this process. Well, why again? And that's what leads to some arrogance as well, right? It was an arrogant comment of me to basically say, hey, I'm pretty sure we can do this. I know we can for most people. And he was like, whoa, let's just make, it's my hip. Let's just make 100% sure
Right.
that we're ready to go. It's not about you. It's not about them. It's about me. And I think that's the refocusing to your point as an athlete is, it's not to be mistaken with taking control of healthcare, because I think that's also a mistake sometimes that like some clients think to make is, well, let me get this person involved and this person involved. I'm like, well, you don't really need that yet. I can help guide you. It's more to your point, being the performance director and finding the people that you can trust to help guide the performance, transition well.
Well, and let's speak directly to the clinicians about putting this model in place. You making that phone call now lets that physician know that you're not a maverick.
Exactly.
So now they can relax and trust you with your side of the process. If you start skipping steps and not telling them, even if the person's ready and they know they're ready, if they think you're just going to jump ahead and not ask or tell or communicate, you're always going to be held back by that physician. So in terms of creating trusted referral networks, communication and over communication is just so critical to understand where everybody's at.
And listen, like, again, I'm just like everybody else, right? And if I looked at that younger version of me, I'd be like, you are not nearly as busy as I am now, right? And like, I get it. Most clinicians, but I don't have the time. I don't have the time, right? Even if it's, hey, are you going to see the doctor real quick? Cool. I'm going to handwrite this note real fast. Just hand it to him, right?
Yeah.
Or like, to me, I love it when I get physicians' cell phone numbers because I can shoot a quick text. Right? Like that. And I think those are the things where that goes a long, long way, not just for, like we talked about, that trust for that athlete or that patient, but also from a perspective of that referral network and how that builds. And I think that is so essential in so many different ways. And it's never been, me communicating with a physician has never been a bad thing, right? It's never been, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a key. I understand what the barrier is for most people. Oh, my time.
Yeah.
I get it. But at the end of the day, if you want to do a good job and be good at your job and be known that you're good at your job, this is a huge piece of that. That's how you do it. Has to be.
So, Brian, we have covered a lot of ground. I like to end here with 3 takeaways that people who aren't pro athletes, right? Your weekend warriors, what are 3 takeaways that if somebody gets injured, people can take away day one and implement right away?
Got it. On that first day.
What's their mindset? What are their 3 takeaways from today's conversation overall that people should be thinking about, and what should their mindset be as they go through an injury process?
The first thing I would say from a mindset perspective is this is not the end, right? I'm not never going to be able to do this again, right? Like,
Love that.
Anybody who says, because you had mentioned this at one point, well, we could just, maybe your career's over at some point. No. If that's an answer, like, I love the idea of, this is why second and third opinions all exist, right? Like, triangulating and trying to figure out what's the best path for you doesn't just rely on one person, right?
Yeah.
So that might be point number 2. Is number 1 would be, this is not the end. You're going to get through this. It might be a long road, but number 2 is finding the people that can help guide you in the right direction, right? Someone who's done it before, someone who's been there before, right? Who's done something that you need. And it might not be me, you know what I mean? It might be somebody else, but starting that process, the third is trying to really, it's hard because I think the other third that I always love of this is to silence the critics, like keep everybody, how many times you heard this? Well, my mother said to do this, and my grandfather said that, and my blah 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 says this, and all I got to do is just do isometrics, right? Like like the Google side. Trust the process, trust the people that you put into place. Because in theory, if I'm like, hey, I have my mindset, my trust, I know that I'm going to get back to normal. I'm going to find my tribe. I'm going to find my people who are going to help me get there. And then, that last part of silencing the critics or just trying to block out some of the noise. Mm-hmm. I get it. You can listen and hear it, and it comes from an empathetic place most of the time, right? Mm-hmm. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end all be all, right? And so ultimately, I think that can be very overwhelming with people. It's kind of like the menu of 1,000 different things, like the diner menu. And so ultimately, I think that's what I would think day one is stay focused on the process, trying to keep yourself motivated. You can even find people who will keep you motivated, right? That's probably the biggest thing that I would say take away. You can start day one.
Yeah. Beautiful, Brian. This has just been amazing, mate. I really appreciate your time today. And how can people either get in touch, support your work, or learn more from you?
Awesome. So evolutionphysicaltherapy.com. That's our company. We're all over in the Los Angeles area, out in the Colorado area. I'm here in Connecticut, Lower Fairfield County, and then obviously in Long Island as well. BT Wolfe02 is one of my Instagrams. So I should probably be posting a lot more than I do. We have also, for those physical therapists and clinicians, for mentorship group, this is where Jez was actually on our podcast. We have a front row, back row podcast that we're trying to help in a company called Physio Growth, where we're trying to help mentor young physical therapists, not just in the, obviously the business side of things, but also in the physical therapy treatment side of things as well, and how to implement these processes and build as well a process. So obviously, if anybody wants to, if it's in our podcast as well, we'd love to have you listen. So that's the front row, back row podcast. That's been a fun passion project with my buddy Owen. So that's been awesome.
Nice. Awesome. Well, we'll put all of that in the show notes, and we'll make sure everyone can find you.
Awesome.
And thanks again.
Of course. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
What a fascinating discussion with Dr. Brian Wolfe on what it really takes to recover from injury. Here are the 3 key takeaways from today's episode. Number 1. This is not the end. An injury isn't the finish line. It's the beginning of a new process. There's always a way back with the right plan. Number 2, find your tribe. Whether you're a pro or a weekend warrior, surround yourself with experts who align with your goals and communicate effectively. Number 3, silence the noise. Everyone will have an opinion, but it's your job to focus on the team you trust and block out unhelpful distractions. If you're navigating recovery and want to integrate high-performance strategies into your life, we'd love to support you. At Vitality Collective, we've designed systems that bring together early detection, individualized care, and performance-based rehab, all tailored to your stage of life and your goals. To explore how this approach could work for you, visit www.vitality-collective.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.